I'd just like to welcome you all this morning. I'm Peter Garrigan, Interim Chair of the Australian Council of State School Organisations, the national voice of families, carers and communities in public education. And I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar, Lessons from Canada, An Equal School System is Possible. You're probably all expecting to see Di Giblin, our CEO, here to host this morning's session. Unfortunately, she's recovering in hospital from surgery. We know she's in good hands and we're all wishing her a smooth recovery, and I'm hosting on her behalf. Today's conversation matters because families experience schooling as a system, not as separate sectors. And when a system becomes more segregated, it shows up in everyday ways. The mix of students in schools, access to opportunities, the concentration of disadvantage, and the pressures on public schools to carry more complexity with fewer supports. So the question for us isn't whether segregation matters, it's what can be done about it and what reform could realistically look like. Before we start, I'd just like to, if you can use the Q&A for questions, and we'll hold those for the end of the session, where we'll go through the questions afterwards. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce both Tom and Chris to you. Tom, first of all, Tom Greenwell. Tom is a teacher, writer and presenter, currently teaching history and politics at Hawker College in the ACT. He's also a long-standing contributor to the National Conversation on Fairness in Schooling, and he co-authored Waiting for Gonski, How It Failed Australian Schools, and Choice and Fairness, a Common Framework for All Australian Schools. Tom brings both policy insight and a classroom-grounded view on what system settings mean in real schools. Welcome, Tom, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.
Chris Bonnor is a former head of the New South Wales Secondary Principals Council and one of Australia's most respected voices on school funding, equity and system design. He has co-authored major work on how schooling structures shape outcomes and opportunity, including Waiting for Gonski, and more recently, Choice and Fairness. Chris has a rare combination of system-level understanding and practical leadership experience, and we're grateful he's here to share with what the Canadian experience can teach Australia. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Peter.
So at this stage, as I said, we'll hold the Q&A until the end of Chris and Tom's presentation. So, guys, over to you.
Yeah, look, thanks, Peter, and a shout out to Di. You know, I worked with Di 20 years ago, and got very fond memories of the sort of work we did together. Yeah, there is a trail there. Started with Waiting for Gonski, and then Ellen Koshland contacted us and wanted just, I guess, to boil down the book Waiting for Gonski into about 20 or 30 pages, which was a lot of fun. But it became Choice and Fairness, a common framework for all Australian schools, and that has triggered other things. It triggered our visit to Canada because we were keen to show. We were keen to discover more about school frameworks that actually worked the way that we felt they should be working. So that really got us going. And Peter, you've indicated we certainly do know about the problems, and we know why this work has to be done. All the research I've done over the years, I constantly get surprised or in fact shocked because things are in a really bad state. So, Peter, if we could start with the first slide, I've got there, or the second one. Yeah, the next one. Yeah, sure. This was work done by Barbara Preston years ago, and she was tracking. I've simplified it to where do our poor kids go to high school, and she's been tracking that from the Australian census going back many years, and it tells a story that we already know, that basically kids that are from low-income families and low SES families are increasingly going to public schools and decreasingly going to private schools. But what really shocks me from that is that in 1986, they weren't far apart. You know, there was a time, we've got to be careful talking about golden eras, but there was a time when there wasn't that huge difference between public and private schools that we have now. Peter, if we go on to the next slide, the interesting thing is that this divergence between schools, and I take your point about being a bit cautious about sort of pointing blame and revitalising that fairly unproductive guerrilla warfare between public and private advocates going back 20 years. But the divergence between, let's call our schools two groups. One, our lower SES schools, and secondly, our higher SES schools. And the cut-off point being the ACSSO 1000. And I know the people in your organisation will be familiar with the sort of that measure of socio-educational advantage in school enrolments. But what's happened in the last, and this is only in the last decade or so, our lower SES schools have barely grown in size in the last decade. Higher SES schools, in terms of their enrolment, have really increased dramatically, up 28%. 70% of all students are in higher SES schools. Now that shows an interesting lopsided system. Our most disadvantaged students have greatly increased in our low SES schools and have increased to some extent in our higher SES schools, but not by as much. Our advantaged students have dropped substantially our proportion of advantaged students have dropped incredibly in our most disadvantaged schools, and to some extent also in advantaged schools, but not by the same degree. But the other thing that really shocked me in the last, and I'm going to come back to this a couple of times because I think it's critical, is that the impact of family and school SES on student outcomes. See, you could argue there's two broad impacts on student outcomes. There's what schools and teachers do, and there's the SES background of the students and the SES profile of their school. We all want what teachers and schools do to have the biggest impact. If that doesn't happen, we're arguably running a bit of a fraudulent system. But what has happened in the last decade or two is that there's an increasing impact of family and school SES on how well kids are going, and a decreasing, in relative terms, impact of teachers and schools. When I did that research, it really rocked me. I didn't think it would. There's always a strong family influence, for family background influence on student achievement. But boy, to see that influence, as distinct from teachers and schools, rapidly increase over the last decade, that really threw me. I just didn't think it was as bad as that. So there's a lot, you can imagine the end point of a system that's heading in that direction. And really, I'm starting to use the language of existential threat when we talk about the gap between our high SES and low SES schools. Peter, let's flick to the next one. The next slide. I was looking at, again, I was looking at different. I've used New South Wales as an example here because I've got the local data, so I can do that. But if you look at where the high achievers are found, what schools they go to, back in 2006, the higher achievers basically went mainly to the higher SES schools and to a lesser extent the lower SES schools. But look how close the two groups of schools are in 2006. And look where they've ended up now in 2012, by 2021. There's been an enormous divergence, with higher SES schools snaring the vast majority of high-level student outcomes. Now, what the media would do would say, or what the league table counters would do would say, oh, well, that shows it. You know, higher SES schools are doing better. They're getting better results. But the data clearly shows they're not getting better results. They're getting higher achieving kids. In other words, there's been an enrolment shift. The enrolment shift to that group of high SES schools, public and private, has created mayhem with our spread of high achievers right across Australia. They're now increasingly found in higher SES schools. Now, the implications of that for us are huge because, again, it really challenges assumptions about school quality. It's not school quality. It's who walks in through the front gate of the school each day. Let's shift to the next one. I spent the last decade trying to explain how our system works. And yes, we often describe it in terms of rich schools and poor schools and private schools and public schools and goodness knows what else. But what I've realised, and working with Tom, what we both realise, is that the 1970s became a critical time in Australia because what we did, we institutionalised the difference between public and private schools. And we created in the process a very unlevel playing field of schools, to the point where it became quite rapidly clear that schools, the two sectors, have unequal obligations. They operate in different ways. They have different resources and different student outcomes. Some, the public schools, have got to be open to all by rule. Others charge fees or set entrance tests. In other words, what we had emerging, especially from the 1970s, although the impact wasn't felt until well into the 90s, I've got to say, because there's always a time lag. You know, when you set up a system like that, there's a time lag before you think, oh my God, what have we created? The result is that we end up with achievers and strugglers in different schools. And that's when it started. So you can draw a link, you can draw a circle, what I've called a wicked problem trapped in a vicious circle. Now, a wicked problem, of course, is a problem that defies our efforts to solve it. And clearly that's happened. So I'll go quickly to stage two. That unlevel playing field, that difference in resources, that difference in rules, that having schools that can have to enrol everybody and having schools that can decide whether they will or won't. All that creates less diversity within schools and more social and achievement gaps between them. And that became increasingly noticed from the 1990s. Despite the effort of teachers, this gathering together of students of equal ability but in different schools started to illuminate something that we call peer effects. In other words, who you sit next to in class matters. Not in a direct way necessarily, and not in a way we talk about, kids, the importance of competition between kids and so on. It's about a whole myriad of things. It's about teacher expectations. It's about level of resourcing for schools. It's about diversity or otherwise in curriculum. It's about things, let's face it, about time on task. In some schools, that's extremely difficult to keep kids focused. And in some schools, it's not a struggle at all. So, and in many ways, so I've got to stage three, as a consequence, some students and schools win, others lose. And this became increasingly obvious in my time as a school principal in the 1990s and shortly after. And then what we've discovered since the early 2000s is that overall student achievement declines. And if that's the case, the less regulated schools, call them selective schools or private schools, I don't care. The less regulated schools will make sure they enrol students who will enhance school results. Because guess why? And we get to stage 4. Schools are judged on raw school results, further widening the gaps between them in image, presentation, achievements and challenges. Your members, Peter, your members would see this in droves in every state. And what was also happening is that these narrow measures of student achievement were starting to be the big drivers of what schooling is all about. And I would argue that has been very counterproductive. But if we go to stage 5, inevitably, parents who can choose, and to choose you need money, you need location, you need mobility, and you need, key contacts. They would be going towards the more advantaged schools. And the accumulative effect of this further tilts that playing field that started to be badly tilted in the 1970s in favour of the advantaged schools. Now, we have tried to intervene in this awful cycle. We've tried to stop it. Peter, and you mentioned the funding of schools. Yes, that is a major intervention, particularly perhaps towards the top of the circle. Putting more money in hopefully would make a difference to those things, hopefully would make public schools or low SES schools more attractive. Rhubarb. 2 problems. The money hasn't arrived because the combination of private and public funding has created, go back to, just take with that one from me, has created a big gap in the total resourcing of schools. Governments do set out to equity fund schools, to fund the lowest SES schools. Private funding, whether intentional or not, whatever, simply undermines what governments set out to do. And we've certainly got that problem. In stage 2 and 3, it's interesting, the other interference that governments do, or the other, intervention, in fairness, is to whack up school reform in schools, really put the pressure on schools to do better. So there's a whole lot of mandates about what schools have got to do. They've got to work harder. They've got you name it. The bottom line is most of those within school reforms in the last 2 decades has made bugger all difference. That leaves us with a third intervention. And this is why this third intervention is what drives Tom's and mine and others' work. Not that it's more important, but it's the thing we haven't done. And let's go to the next slide. Because the thing we haven't done is actually shifting what the whole framework of schools looks like and how it functions and what on earth is it doing to create this awful enrolment segregation. So really, you could look at, there are about 4 or 5 features of our system that can really be explained by our rotten school framework. We've got one of the most segregated systems. It's worsening. Even Gonski pointed to that. He didn't do much about it, but he pointed to it as the problem. Next is that the social composition of schools has an impact that's just as strong as the student's own family background. That's what ACSSO found about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. I have found that it doesn't have an impact just as strong. It's got an impact now that is increasingly stronger than what the teachers in schools do. Holy smokes, as a teacher all my life, as a school principal for 15 years, that frightens the tripe out of me. And it plays out, the way it plays out in schools, and we know more about this now, it's a peer impact on learning. It's that peer impact that is increasingly now, and recent research is doing this, is measuring what impact it has. And you can measure the disadvantaging impact in terms of number of months or years of lost schooling, especially in secondary schools. Now, we know this, This is the irony of our current era. The Productivity Commission measured this several years ago. The months and years of lost learning. Concentration of disadvantage? Oh, come on. We all know that. And in fact, the federal government's review, the review to inform a better and fairer education system, flagged that stuff as being essential to the solution. So there's no more excuses. But what drives our system at the moment is what we don't do. So our biggest problem is that we've done nothing to fix. We've done nothing to fix that framework stuff. Now, that is cutting a long story short. I'm going to pass to Tom in a sec. But that combination of factors, along with the unregulation of fees, along with the policies of inclusion or exclusion, the peer effects, the disparities of resources between schools, that combination of things has taken us to our current state. And quite frankly, I could have a look at my school data and I could predict, we talk about full funding in 2030, 2034, 5, 6, 7? We talk about this and we rely on that a lot. But I reckon even if that funding comes through, I could pretty well sit down and detail what our whole framework of schools is going to look like in 2030, in the low 2030s. And I'd have to say, on current trends, it's not going to look any better. It's going to look worse. Sorry to be so dismal. Tom, start cheering us up, for goodness sake.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And Peter, if we go to the next slide, and look, we'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but if people have urgent or there's something that they'd like to ask about, please jump in too. So what I want to do is say, we know Australia has one of the most segregated systems in the OECD. Chris has outlined that, and he's outlined that the problem is getting worse and it has a very negative effect on student learning. We were lucky enough to go to Canada in late 2024 looking for solutions. And I should say at the outset that in Canada, education is a purely provincial responsibility. So we really went to, in educational terms, we think of Canada as kind of like 10 different countries or 10 different jurisdictions. We're going to focus on Ontario because I think it's got the most interesting model for us. It's also the biggest province, about 40% of the national population. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, Peter, in Ottawa, we visited Notre Dame High School. Notre Dame is a Catholic school. It's as Catholic as any Australian Catholic school in the sense that it has a focus on faith formation. It teaches, it has a religious education. It has mass. There's a prayer over the loudspeaker every day. The religious curriculum is defined by the Ontario Bishops' Council. And so in every sense, an Australian Catholic school is a faith-based school. So is Notre Dame. But the difference about Notre Dame is that it's also a public school in the sense that it is fully publicly funded and it is prohibited from charging fees, and it enrolls students from a local attendance zone who have a right to attend that school. And so what that means is that Notre Dame is in one of the more disadvantaged parts of Ottawa, and it enrolls proportionally twice as many students from low-income families as the Ontario average, and 3 times as many students from families with low educational achievement. Ontario has a program called the Urban and High Priority Student kind of supplement, and about 75%, and it's targeted to students who are facing risk of suspension or expulsion, have had experiences with the criminal justice system, difficulties attending, and that kind of thing. About 3/4 of Notre Dame students are eligible for that program. So, this is a school that is, doing really amazing work in terms of serving students from often very challenging backgrounds. And so if we can probably flick through the next couple of slides, because they're just emphasizing that Notre Dame cannot charge fees, and maybe back one. So cannot charge fees, and doesn't have to, because it is funded on exactly the same basis as secular public schools. We visited the board of which this school is a part, the Catholic Ottawa School Board, and then the next day we visited the public or the secular school board. And not only did they talk about cooperating with each other and having good mutual relations, but their students on average across the whole boards, which are a system of schools, received the same funding. So it's a public school and a Catholic school at the same time. Okay, so next slide. What that means is that Ontario's faith schools enrol a much higher share of disadvantaged students than their Australian counterparts. What we're looking at here is not about Ontario, it's about Australia. And it breaks up Australia's Catholic schools in terms of where they fall into socioeconomic deciles, where decile 1 is the 10% of schools enrolling the most disadvantaged students in Australia. And what you see is that there are only, I think, in the lowest 4 deciles, in the most disadvantaged 4 deciles, you only find about 11% of Catholic schools, 11 or 13% of Catholic schools. Whereas if we were looking at this in Ontario, essentially these bars would be even all the way across. These faith-based schools are enrolling the same proportion of disadvantaged students as secular public schools as well. And so that means that across the whole system, there is much greater socioeconomic diversity within each school. You don't have the overwhelming concentration of social disadvantage in particular schools. So we go to the next slide. What we see here is the purple bar is Australia, and this is showing that in terms of, if you line up OECD countries, we have one of the most segregated systems in the developed world. You then go across and you see in the blue bar the OECD average, and then you go across and you start to get into, you're looking at the Scandinavian countries right at the extreme, and Canada's kind of right up there with them in terms of having relatively low concentration of disadvantage in particular schools. So this is a measurement of schools where essentially 50% of or more of students come from that most disadvantaged quarter of the population. And notice there that where we are is we're next to countries like Brazil and Chile, who, historically, like in their whole society, have much greater social inequality. So what we're doing with unregulated fees, unregulated enrollment practices, and resource disparities is our school system is creating these concentrations of disadvantage over and above residential segregation, which is a real factor, but education policy is making it so much worse. And just to emphasize this, just to move on to the next slide, here we're seeing a similar kind of comparison, but as well as having a comparison between countries, and again, we see that Australia has this much higher level of segregation than Canada in the purple. We also have the Canadian provinces, and we see there that Ontario is below the Canada average. But interestingly, you might notice between Canada and Australia, we find Quebec. And more about that a bit later. but Quebec essentially has very similar policy settings to Australia. It's right next door to Ontario, but as I say, education is a purely provincial responsibility, and its system is designed a lot more like ours. And guess what? You have a lot more social segregation. So that takes us to the next slide. So what we've seen so far is the common framework or the full public funding across faith-based and secular schools in Ontario reduces segregation. And now we see that reducing segregation enhances student achievement. And we've got here, you see in all domains in the most recent round of PISA, Ontario is performed significantly higher than Australia on average. And that has been the case in every round of PISA since the test's inception. Now, I want to be really clear here. Chris and I are not suggesting that introducing this kind of policy would immediately get a PISA bounce, or that's even what it's about. What it's about is creating the structural conditions for success. And what I mean by that is just let's remember, what Chris told us about when you concentrate an overwhelming number of disadvantaged students in the same schools and classrooms, we know that reduces time on task. We know that means that students receive less individualized attention. We know that it means that the curriculum will often be narrowed, and students won't have access to curriculum that will give them, a diversity of post-school options. We know that an overwhelming concentration of students with high needs inevitably has an effect on teacher morale and teacher recruitment. And, the teacher shortages do not affect the system equally, as Chris has shown graphically. So often it means that the schools with huge numbers of disadvantaged students, which really need a lot of support, are the schools that find it hardest to staff their schools. So these and many other factors are what constitute such a drag on what Australia is trying to do, what teachers are trying to do, what principals are trying to do, and what parents are trying to do to support our young people. And what Ontario exhibits is a policy solution where you remove these levers that are driving disadvantaged students into the same schools, which will allow us an opportunity to succeed. So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is actually what I think is the really, really important bit for ACSSO. Because I know you will have a significant awareness of the problem of social segregation and an openness to addressing some of the policy problems. But I think a blocker for so many people is, what about achieving political change? Yes, Ontario might sound wonderful. Wouldn't it be good if we had that here? But can we really achieve it? Let's go to the next slide. First of all, I want to answer this by saying our main policy focus, I talk about we collectively as public education activists, and I know advocates, and I know, ACSSO has done, incredibly admirable work for many, many years, campaigning for full public funding full funding to the SRS of public schools. The reality is the agreement that was struck last year is about what governments are going to do next decade. It's a commitment for full funding by 2034 with some asterisks. Okay, and as I've said there, the Commonwealth has promised very significant additional sums, but a mere fraction, a couple of % of that is committed this decade in the forward estimates. They will spend less additional money on Australian public schools than they will on the American submarine industry this decade. And my point is that, all of us have been around. we remember when Julia Gillard outlined a 6-year timeline to get to full funding, but did put most of the hard work beyond the forward estimates in years 5 and 6, and that was postponed. Now we're being told the same story. And we have multiple elections, multiple budget cycles before then. And so we really have to say it's not only a long delay, it's a question of if that will arrive. The other big variable is, even if we get there, even if governments come through on their commitments, what are the non-government sectors going to do in the meantime? Are they going to stop campaigning for more funding for their schools? I don't think so. And even if full funding arrives sometime in the middle of the 2030s, we will still have the unlevel playing field where those schools can top up their resources through private sources, through charging fees, can pick and choose their students as they wish. And so the same problem of social segregation will exist. So my point is actually, we need to start by recognizing that our present strategy has failed. We have not, as a kind of political coalition, succeeded in achieving our goal. And every indication is we're not on track to succeed. So much effort, so much incredible advocacy has been executed by many, many people and many, many organizations. But it's not working. So if we go to the next slide, our argument is that politically, to really shift the dial, we need to grow our coalition. We actually need to develop an alliance across the sectors, calling for full public funding of all schools and a level playing field for all our schools. And only when we get a kind of a coalition of public education advocates with a section of a part of the non-government sector, it might be low fee schools, it might be those people who are very committed to social justice and are concerned that their schools exclude the poor and the disadvantaged. We need to build a bridge and develop an advocacy coalition with those groups to really move politicians. It's only then that the kind of elitists who want public subsidies for schools that can charge very high fees and exclude disadvantaged students will face a real challenge to their position of privilege. And I think the reason why this argument should be persuasive is this is what we see in Ontario. In Ontario, they introduced needs-based funding a quarter of a century ago. And when I say introduced it, they announced the policy and full needs-based funding was delivered to all schools, within a year. And if you ask why they were able to do it and why we've been effectively failing to do it for over half a century now, part of the reason has got to be that about 93% of families enroll their child in a fully publicly funded school, whether faith-based or secular. So you have a massive coalition. If you're a politician, you have a massive chunk of the electorate who is saying, we want a good deal for our school. So many people are invested in the publicly funded system. I should have made clear that that's 7% of schools that are fee charging receive no public funding. And again, why is that? Well, I think part of the explanation is they're relatively weak politically. They exist and they make that choice, but they are relatively marginal politically because they don't have this alignment with all they're not politically aligned with all the faith-based schools that are part of the fully funded common framework. So I'm actually making the argument that not only is this achievable to achieve the kind of really desirable policy outcomes that Ontario exhibits, it's actually more achievable than what we've been doing. What we've been doing as a kind of a campaigning and a political strategy has turned out just not to work. Next slide, please, Peter. So, yeah, finally, just to reiterate, what I think the common framework, and to be clear, I'm talking about a system in which faith-based schools, non-government schools are eligible for full public funding as long as they agree to stop charging fees and to enrol students on an inclusive basis, allowing them to prioritise students from their faith communities to maintain their distinctive ethos, and giving them the autonomy to determine their own curriculum and so on, but accepting that common regulatory environment. What that achieves, what that offers is a win-win solution. People who want equity, like ourselves, people who want to have a choice that reflects their distinctive worldview, all benefit. This would also, for politicians enable them to offer huge cost of living relief. You know, we just had a report from the Australia Institute that, you know, the amount spent on secondary education every year is, I think, on average, getting into $5,000-6,000 because of the number of Australian families who send their kids to non-government schools. Put downward pressure on inflation, boost productivity because our schools would be so much, and our school systems would be so much more effective, and boost social cohesion. So we think this is actually a politically plausible plan and would be more politically achievable than the kind of strategy we're on now. I think that brings me to a conclusion, and I'll hand back to Chris, who's going to pick up the example of Quebec, which I think carries on nicely.
Yeah.
I think a couple more slides.
Yeah, you're right, Tom. Yeah.
Oh, look, yeah. Sorry, Chris. Yeah, just
right.
really quickly. We could discuss this in Q&A, but you know, one of the big objections, of course, is that it's simply impossible to fully fund compulsory education. We have to have a parental contribution for some of our schools. You know, a place like Ontario shows that's not the case. They spend essentially the same proportion of their GDP on education as we do. They fully fund 93% of their schools. The reality is we so heavily fund our non-government sector now that the lift, and Chris has shown this, the lift to fully fund these schools is pretty marginal. We're talking perhaps $1 or $2 billion in recurrent expenditure a year. Yeah, so finally, I should just say, you might not buy this idea of fully funding non-government schools. That might be a bridge too far. It's not, the fundamental point here is not actually the content or the details of the common framework. The important thing is that a policy and political solution requires a framework that addresses how the sectors fundamentally impact each other. We can't just keep championing, you know, more money for public schools without some way modifying how non-government schools are operating, because they're pulling the rug from underneath our feet. All right, thanks a lot. So now I'll hand over to Chris.
Peter, how are we placed? Do you want to any quick questions at this stage, or what would you like?
Nothing's come through at this point in time, Chris. So let's keep going, and we'll go to the Q&A at the end.
Yeah, okay. Look, it was interesting the note that Tom ended on, the idea of because one of the things that often gets thrown up to us is the issue, my goodness, why would a secular public system support fully funding faith schools? And it wasn't hard to find out, as I did with a colleague about 10 years ago, we're practically already fully funding faith schools now. Not on average, but when you compare the funding of the sectors, you've got to compare apples with apples. You've got to compare schools that are enrolling the same sort of kids. And we rapidly found out that Catholic schools especially, although now increasingly independent schools, are getting around about the same funding per student as students in similar government schools. But look, let's get on to the issue of Quebec. Quebec was really interesting. When we planned to go to Canada, my first reaction when we found out more about Quebec was, oh my goodness, this rather spoils the Canada story, because here's this province that is, well, I describe it as a province that is in a race to the bottom in its education system. And its partner in a race to the bottom, or its competitor, arguably, is Australia. In other words, they're just as bad as we are, and they're getting worse, and so are we. But then I realised, hey, this lends really serious strength to the argument that Tom has been talking about. The fact that in Canada, just as globally, we find that systems that don't have systems that fully fund their inclusive schools are the systems that are doing okay. And the systems that sort of drive a wedge between publicly funded schools and semi-privately funded private schools are in trouble. But look, in Quebec, we actually spent, in fact, we've probably done more work on Quebec since we left Canada in many ways, just looking at exactly what's going on. But we met a person called Stéphane Vigneault. And Stéphane...
Next slide, Peter.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. We do have slides. Here we go. Stéphane, actually, his qualifications are that he's a concerned parent. And he approached the whole problem of Quebec schools from the point of view of a concerned parent. And the problems of Quebec schools, it's hard to sum them up. But basically, all the data shows that Quebec is roughly between Australia at the bottom and Ontario at the top in things like student retention, post-school destinations, school achievement, whatever, you name it. But Stéphane years ago decided that we need to do something about this, because just as we have in Australia, to typecast Stéphane as a parent is to sell him, just as often happens in Australia, selling parents very, very short. And you don't do that with Stéphane, and you don't do it with our public school parent community. And I discovered this over many, many years working with parents in school councils and P&Cs and so on. But basically what Stéphane has done is to, and the documentation that is on the screen now, develop a plan for a common school network. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the network, because what Tom described in the context of Ontario, to make a long story short, is basically what Stéphane is planning for Quebec. And when I say planning, the campaign that they have mounted over the last 8 years has been so successful that in Quebec, public opinion polling shows a clear majority support for a common framework along the lines of Ontario, and certainly along the lines of what Stéphane and his team indicate in their plan. That is very, very significant. Now, their plan, in fact, is before the Quebec Parliament, not in drafted legislation as yet. Well, sorry, it is in the form of drafted legislation, but that has to be accepted by the Quebec government before it is put to Parliament. So they have come a very, very long way from being in a system that was facing terminal decline to solutions that are circulated well in Quebec. And yes, they're controversial, but has gained the support of key operators in Quebec, including the teachers and the teacher unions. So that, in a way, is incredibly promising. And Stefan has written up the campaign of his organisation, École Ensemble, a School Together movement. He's written up their campaign. So there's a real track record of what a common front of supporters can achieve in a difficult environment like Quebec. And that is very, very encouraging. So much so, it's not only that has encouraged it, but in Australia now, we have about we have a range of movers and shakers looking at this space, looking at solutions. And if you think back, Peter, a decade ago, the movers and shakers in school policy were the AEU, the Peak Catholic Organisation, the Peak Independent Organisation, and the state governments, which allegedly represented public education, but actually which didn't, and still don't.
That's correct.
In fact, state governments have a vested interest in making sure that the increasing numbers of schools in their states are private schools and not public schools. Why? Because if they're established, guess who picks up the recurrent costs of the schools? The Commonwealth. And I got to say that in the Quebec context, the fly in the ointment that we have, i.e., our federal system, doesn't exist in Canada, because the federal government in Canada has very little say and very little operation in school education, with the exception of additional support for Indigenous and disadvantaged communities. But what has happened in Australia, and we have contributed to this, we can't take credit for it, but we have contributed to a whole range of different organisations that are telling the same story that we're telling, and talking about either the same or similar solutions. And I add to that people that you may even you would know. You might have heard of a bloke called John Bush, who was working for the
Paul Ramsay Foundation.
The Paul Ramsay Foundation. Yeah. John has had two stabs at this. And the Paul Ramsay Foundation came up with a far more equitable range of school regulations than we've ever seen about 5 years ago, and its board knocked it back. But then in the last few years, it says, hey, this problem's not going away. It's got to be solved. So it commissioned John Bush and his team again to come up with another set of solutions. And at the moment, he's working independently to sort of press the right buttons to get some movement. But the other people you've seen, about Michelle Bruniges, who was once a Director General of Education in New South Wales, she's working with another organisation on not only measuring the concentration of disadvantage, but coming up with specific policy pointers to what to do about it. We've got there's another ASPA. Well, ASPA. Now you guys work with ASPA substantially. Andy Myson came to Canada with us, and Andy Myson has, I believe, shifted the focus of ASPA to look at the whole issue of structuring of school education in Australia, and the important place of a common framework in whatever we do from now on. And Andy has very good contacts with the federal minister, and ASPA, in my experience going back years, ASPA ain't necessarily the most progressive organisation all the time. And I know at one stage New South Wales and Victoria bailed out of ASPA. They're now back in, thank goodness, because the work that ASPA is doing now is brilliant, quite frankly. And then other organisations about, Learning Creates, you might probably know about in Victoria. Australian Learning Lecture, Ellen Koshland, the group that partially supported us, it has a solid track record of brokering innovation in school education. If you remember, you might remember a document called Beyond ATAR. So Australian Learning Lecture, Ellen, with her colleagues, was instrumental in getting a rethink of the role of ATAR, I suppose the straitjacketing role of ATAR for tertiary entry. And to the point now where I think only about a third of university students use an ATAR to gain entry. So what I mean is these innovative organisations and innovative people have now been beavering away for about 4 or 5 years. So there, long story short, there's a movement. There's movement in the direction, towards the direction that we're talking about. Look, we make no apologies. Yes, it is a common framework we're aiming for. Not only that, if you're looking for a model where it works best, it works to an extent in New Zealand, but we unashamedly point to Ontario as the gold standard. I think it's time for me to shut up and you guys to throw in whatever you need.
Yes. And thank you both very much for that presentation. Let me just clear my screen here, and I'll unspotlight you, Chris.
And can you spotlight Donna and Leanne and David?
They're set up so they've got no cameras or microphones.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Yes. And I suppose the thing, it was a great presentation and an explanation of your points in relation to Canada and comparing it with Australia. What we'll look for those attending, if we've got the Q&A, that's if you have any questions, please feel free to make use of that. But I suppose while they're cogitating and thinking about things, I'll start with a couple of questions, and I won't say Tom or Chris. Both of you just fly in if you could. And I suppose the question for me, and I've read the lessons from Canada. If you had to summarise the single biggest lesson that you got for Australia in, say, one sentence, what would it be?
Mine would be there is an alternative, because in Australia, a lot of our discussion and debate about schools, school funding, student achievement is constrained within a set of unexamined assumptions. One is the one I mentioned, that we couldn't fully fund all schools and require them to be free because we just can't afford it. Another is that if you're a public school, you have to be secular. Another is that if you're a religious school, you have to charge fees. We have a series of assumptions that it has to be like this. And we have been trying to create this dual system of fully publicly funded and publicly subsidised schools, while trying to overlay it with needs-based funding and allowing some schools to charge fees. We've been trying to reconcile the tensions involved in that for 50 years. And there's a lot of recognition that it doesn't work. But when we look at very similar, but there's a lack of really imaginative thinking about solutions. And when we look at similar countries to ourselves, that's why we found Canada and Ontario are important. Similar history, political culture, demographic, etc. They have different educational policy settings, which make everyone better off. So we need to recognise that we are making a choice to continue with the status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. I suppose I took back from Canada a weird observation I found, because I know our system in Australia, we are really outriders. We are outriders. There's no other achieving system that does what we. Oh, there's other countries that do what we're doing, but they're at the wrong end of that global equity set of graphs that Tom showed. So in a way,
that's where Quebec is so illustrative. Yeah.
Yeah, and I came back quite excited because we found someone just like Australia, which is a pretty dreadful thing to say.
Which is sad.
Which is sad, but but the other part of the excitement is that, my goodness, they're doing something about it. And you know what? The people leading the way out of their situation are not necessarily the academics, not necessarily governments or oppositions, but a grassroots organisation organised and triggered by a parent group and by one or two movers and shakers. I mean, gee, that really amazed me. And before we go too far down the track, we'd like to invite these people to come out to Australia or at least talk to us about what they've done.
I agree. And you mentioned in the presentation, and I'm keeping an eye out here for anyone that's put a Q&A in, which hasn't happened as yet, but you mentioned about the common framework. Now, when people hear about those sorts of things, they often assume it's ideological or unrealistic. Practically speaking, what do you see are the key elements of a framework that would make it work?
So, practically speaking, what it's saying is that all schools that receive public funding should have commensurate public obligations. But we should respect that within a publicly funded system, there will be a diversity of views about the kind of ethos and character of schools, and there should be options that reflect that diversity of views. So in really concrete terms, in the common framework, all schools are fully publicly funded, whether they're secular, like our public schools, or non-government faith-based schools. They are prohibited from charging fees. They are subject to the same common regulatory environment, which would include a combination of local school zones, like applying to systemic Catholic schools and independent schools, as well as public schools, but also where you might, for instance, have a particular school which is either a specialist curriculum or it's outside of a system. There you use mechanisms like reserved quotas for disadvantaged students. So a school must have a minimum of 20% of students from the most disadvantaged quarter. Or we see a range of mechanisms that you can design a regulatory environment so all schools are obliged to be inclusive. But faith-based schools continue to be allowed to prioritise enrolment of students from their faith community and maintain the same autonomy over curriculum and ethos that they have right now. So we kind of recognise that we do already, effectively fully publicly fund these schools, and that whole kind of debate about public funding of religious schools has sailed away. It's about the shared obligations.
Yeah.
Leanne has put a comment in the chat, wondering if you talk to PNC Federation New South Wales. The PNC Federation New South Wales has a pre-budget submission to New South Wales Treasury identifying areas to improve performance and wellbeing. If some of their ideas can get traction with the Federation to advocate, it might be beneficial. That's something.
I'd like to see that, because if we're finding stuff coming out of the woodwork from various organisations that touch on the problems we're talking about, and that gives us an opportunity to broaden our view, but also to engage with these organisations and the ideas they're proposing. So I'd like to see that.
Yeah, and I mean the short answer is that we haven't spoken with them. And interested, Leanne, thanks, please, because I'm interested, Leanne. What is the connection between the kinds of things that they're advancing and and what we're discussing.
Oh, you've got it.
Ah,
Oh, you're on mute.
Let's see if I can help you there, Leanne.
We go.
No.
Oh, great. You can hear
There
me.
you go.
Excellent.
yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm sure you'll be able to get the link anyway if you just put in the PNC Federation New South Wales. And it's a New South Wales state budget for 2026-27. And it's a pre-budget submission to the New South Wales Treasury. So, I mean, obviously it's backing off last year when they decided to do the full funding and that got awarded. But what they've been doing is been very proactive in surveys and talking to different federations. And at that conference last November, it was just to find out where, you know, all the hot topics are. But what it's come up with, and they talk quite a bit with Prukar and Murat in regards to different aspects. And the Federation now struck agreement in New South Wales with the Federation maybe about 2.5 years ago that the PNC needs to be more involved, not in cake stalls or supplying infrastructure, but actually to be involved in policy and budgeting in schools, which has been excellent. So they have really been very proactive in talking a lot, it seems like, to state government anyway. But if you check out that thing, but what they have a framework that they've had to but they're just looking at recommendations, and one is just, you know, air conditioning, you know, that everyone's got to be in the right environment to be able to learn. The one that interests me the most in regards to me, because I'm actually from regional New South Wales, Glen Innes, 8,000 people, but we have to travel, you know, just to do basic sporting opportunities or any extracurricular stuff, which is a huge cost to the parent. And the PNC, you know, have been quite instrumental in helping with, you know, the bus fees. But one of their recommendations that I'm actually talking to our principal about this afternoon is their recommendation to expand the school student transport systems for subsidised travel. So, you know, we have school bus runs in our country, but we ended up having to pay those same suppliers to take us, you know, to the neighbouring town just to do a gala day. I mean, we have our own school bus as well, but I mean, it's still, you know, a cost that, say, a Tamworth school, you know, they just walk down to the Oval. Well, how convenient. So that, but it also encompasses, you know, even the Western or regional sport and active recreation transport program. So it's still city-based as well. The other thing is just encouraging kids to walk to school. The other one was a dental program, and the last identified thing was just investing money into high quality music education, essential for well-rounded education. So like if you start talking to them about this stuff, I feel like you just sort of, you've got your little, you're the experts in looking at other countries and what they're doing and stuff, but that mix might be quite good. And Gemma Quinn is the CEO there of New South Wales, and she is, I really like her. I've only met her once, but they're very good at getting advocacy going for public education.
Okay. Gemma, so where is she based and what's her position?
She's out of Sydney, so she's the CEO of the New South Wales PNC Federation. But then there's also a board that represents a lot of the different regions across New South Wales. So Gemma, I think, has been in that role for a couple of years. She's got a legal background. So, yeah, she's doing a really good job there and talking, to, the Department of Education and really trying to look at things. And it feels like she's being heard and really forming a great base of people around her through all the P&C federations throughout the state. So that might be a nice little place.
That's really, thank you, Leanne. That's really helpful. And I'm interested, in your view and the kind of meetings kind of view of, moving beyond over and above, like obviously there's this very urgent imperative of full public funding for public schools and meeting the schooling resource standard. It's just kind of a disgrace that governments have said, this is what schools need to succeed, but we're delaying delivering it for decades. And it breaks down into so many elements, and you've spoken about them. But do you think there is a potential appetite to kind of advocate in terms of how all our schools work together as a system, non-government and government, and recognise that they're all publicly funded and that they all
I think so. I mean, I'm interested just to hear today that, based on per capita type thing, that the other schools get just as much funding. So, I mean, that's just rubbish. I mean, in Glen Innes, we have one public high school, and we lose kids, to go an hour down the road or down another couple of hours to a public boarding school. I mean, it breaks my heart that we do that, but it's through all the things that you're talking about today. And my husband and I, we went to school at Glen Innes High School. We've been able to be tertiary educated. We run our own business, like all that stuff. I mean, to stay with your family is like the key to, I mean, I'm a public education through and through, and I'll back that. But there is heaps of, complex issues at the school. And because we have to take everyone that walks through that door, I was just at a meeting at the school this week, and they were looking at upgrading the behaviour policy at the school and the process and how to deal with that. I mean, there's so many levels before they even get into, and it's all tied back to demographics. Yeah.
Indeed.
So if we can sort that out, it just makes our high school much better as well. We have great families here. We have great teachers. We provide an excellent education, but to be able to have that opportunity to teach just doesn't happen, because we've got to sort out how best to structure the school with resources. And it's so hard for schools because they're teachers. They haven't done business degrees. They haven't, done any of that stuff. I mean, some might have the skills and can evolve into that, but it nearly needs to be, decided from a government level. Well, this is how we're best to organise schools and just let teachers teach.
Yeah.
And so much is systemic, right? Oh, sorry, Pete.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, part of what schools deal with in behaviour management policies is different responsibilities and obligations. If you're intaking a group of students who have been sent to you from the school down the road because they're able to expel or, ask students to leave as they wish, and you don't have that alternative, that permeates what you can do with a behaviour management policy and how you can respond. So the whole nature of what you're doing as a school is shaped by that.
Yes.
So I suppose if you were going to, within the next 12 to 24 months, make a step in the right direction, what would you prioritise?
Yeah, so I'll go quickly on this, Chris.
Yeah, right.
The first thing, so in policy terms, we need to prioritise the recommendation that the independent expert panel for better and fairer schools, commissioned by Education Minister Clare, made. They said we need to have annual public measurement of the socio-economic diversity of our school system. The recommendation has not been acted on. we need to demand that it is. They secondly recommended that there be an additional new review, essentially doing what we tried to start with lessons from Canada, looking at policy levers to improve socioeconomic diversity. We need to demand that review. And yeah, they should be our immediate priorities. One more point before I hand to Chris. In addition to all the organisations he said are acting, there is a new kind of movement which has taken off, led by a parent, called Roadmap to Reform. And it is trying to develop a coalition of people saying, we know the segregation problem, we know the inequity problem, we need a public political campaign for change. We need to get on with focusing on how we can bring the Australian community towards a solution. I think those are the immediate policy objectives, and Roadmap to Reform is a really important vehicle to pursue them.
And the leader of Roadmap to Reform is another parent. Right. And it's in that capacity that he has created this movement. Yeah, I should have mentioned him earlier. So it's most important. Look, what I'd like to do, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to find in New South Wales or in any other state, a country town like Glen Innes that has a local public school and a local Catholic school. I want it to be a town where the Catholic school is going broke and the public school is struggling. And I'd like to pilot a common framework that operates in that town and those schools, where they share resources, where they are both equally funded per student based on need, and I'd like to see it trialled. In other words, I sometimes think it's very hard to even explain what we are proposing without something on the ground that points us in the direction of what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I suppose, and this is something that we have to, as parents, you've got to grapple with all the time. And it's really looking at, what do you say to families who feel stuck? They want to support public education, but they also feel they must pursue, say, the best advantage for their kids that the system can give them. And it's because that's what it all boils down to. That's why we're all involved. We want the best for our kids. In this current environment, what would you say to them?
We can't blame them. We can't blame them. We have spent decades making value judgments about decisions made by parents. And hey, my own family, my own extended family. Do you want me to recite off the private schools in Sydney that my extended family are involved with? The point is that they're making decisions in what they see as the best interests of their children.
Yes.
And in many cases in Sydney, for example, parents that are concerned will make sure they commute to the other side of Sydney to go to a public school that they want their kids to go to. We have to deal with that. Our solution deals with that.
Yes.
Because the rules that are created are fair and equal, and nobody, for example, in Ontario, wants to change that. It works. But let's forget the blame. Let's forget the labelling. And my work over the last half dozen years has been talking about low and high SES schools rather than public and private.
Mm.
Yeah,
which is a critical thing.
Yeah, just to add to Chris's excellent point, I think we can operate on two levels. As a public school teacher and advocate, I'll always say, look, the values of public schools, that we're all in it together, are a compelling reason why public school is the best option. The academic research shows that academic outcomes, when you account for the socioeconomic profile of schools, are just as good as non-government schools, et cetera, et cetera. We can make all those arguments, and I do, but we need to recognise that it's policymakers who are the problem. They create a system which puts parents in an invidious position where parents do have to look at the school and go, wow, there's a lot of kids with a lot of needs, and where does my kid, when do they get remembered in this scenario? And hey, it's not got enough funding, and this other school's got better resources. So what does that mean for their future? We've put parents in a difficult position. That's not their fault. That's the fault of policymakers, and that's where we need to target our advocacy the change.
Funnily enough, there's also little things that we can do. I was interested in the point that Leanne was raising about student travel to school and so on. Other Canadian provinces do things like, as well as Ontario, do things like, you're funded, your kids are funded to go to the nearest school, public or private, doesn't matter.
With a place on the bus. With a place on the bus.
Yeah, that's right. They get free transport. But in Sydney, we spend don't even know now what the New South Wales budget or expenditure on student travel is. When I retired, it was 2/3 of $1 billion per year. I imagine. I think I'd have trouble getting that information, I suspect now. But that's a huge area where you could make incremental changes that would create benefits straight away, apart from anything else, releasing a lot of money that can be done for other things.
Yes. Does anyone have any questions at all? Because I'm conscious we're just about out of our time. No? Did Chris and Tom, did you want to throw any last thoughts in at all?
I would just reiterate two key messages. Oh, here we go. Here's one from Damien.
Yes. Of the potential strategy.
Is that state parent organisation or that you're referring to, Damien?
Damien, yeah.
Damien, when you say is every state aware, you're talking about jurisdictions? This is
you're just on mute.
Hang on, let me see if I can do something here, seeing as you've got camera. People. Damien. Hello. Damien, try taking your mic on.
Got it.
Got it.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. I guess my question really is, peak bodies in every state aware of this potential strategy. And if they are aware, and Peter, you might know, is there support from across each state for this strategy?
The strategy outlined by Tom and Chris.
By Tom, yeah.
They all would be aware, and I would hope that they are all in support of it. The total it's really going to be interesting in the next year or two, where we have to come up with the strategies, as both Chris and Tom have talked about, to push the agenda and get the political will to do what's required. Now, that means we've got to look at who's in the tent and who's not, if I could put it that way. Because sometimes the people in the tent have a bigger push than those outside the tent. And historically, the public school sector, as was said at the beginning of the presentation, normally have the state governments in the tent, in inverted commas. And their objective, as I think it was Chris said, is to have non-government schools being non-government schools, because that's where they then get their money from the feds. And that's where we've got to work, both with the states and territories and the Commonwealth, to move it forward.
Yeah, I agree, Peter. If we can move that, yeah.
I'd add a couple of points. I feel like in terms of bringing the peak parent bodies, on board, a focus on, like, a starting point is that one I mentioned, that there are these outstanding recommendations just to measure the problem. If we can't even measure the problem, we're not going to solve it. But to have that annually every year, socioeconomic segregation is getting worse. A kind of a NAPLAN, but a NAPLAN focused not at what 8-year-olds are doing, but what policymakers are doing. That would be huge. If we can have a review to create the political space to think about solutions, but both, getting people to commit to advocate for those things doesn't lock them into some of the more controversial solutions.
Sure.
Focuses on let's think creatively together. Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Damien?
Yeah, I'll take your analogy, Peter, more in the tent obviously creates more of a push and more advocacy, especially if all stayed through the tent. So
yeah, and historically, the government school system is not as proactive as our non-government non-government schools in advocating for ourselves, and that's where we've got to get better at it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And that's been our problem only for 40 years.
Yes.
Forever. Yeah.
But this is where, and Chris mentioned the secondary principals particularly are taking a real lead, and that's, I think, really exciting to see what they've been doing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, our object from the beginning has been to open a conversation, get the conversation started. And this is why we really appreciate the time with you guys today. It's been really good.
Yeah. And this is the part of our objective to really get the conversation going. It was we put stuff in our newsletter. We've been putting stuff out for a while about the lessons from Canada as a way forward, that we've got to start the discussion, because if people aren't aware, and it has gone to all of the state and territory peaks as well. And I would hope that each of those parent bodies in their board meetings and spreading the word further afield are actively engaged in an internal discussion on potential ways forward for this. And working within their own jurisdictions, as well as pushing it up.
And if there's ways we can help,
Thank you, Chris. Yes. Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today, and to thank you both, Chris and Tom, for a fantastic presentation. For ACSSO, I'd say the takeaway is that the system design isn't abstract, and we've got to look at the shapes of what families and schools experience every day. And I also, as I said earlier, if we can encourage you to share the ideas further afield, because it's through the networks that we'll be able to develop this system of a fairer school process and move hopefully more towards the Canadian positive model. I'd just like to say again, thank you very much. And guys, have a great day and spread the word, please.
Thanks so much. Thanks
very much, Peter. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Chris.